Before we get into today's case, let's play a game. I'll hide 3 objects in this video, and whoever finds them first and replies to the pinned comment with the answer and exact time codes wins an SKD t-shirt. The 3 categories you're looking for when searching for the objects are summer, mobile phones, and music. The comment must not be edited. And this is made possible by today's sponsor, Sherlock, Hidden Objects. With Sherlock, you'll have to solve match 3 puzzles and find hidden objects to restore the original plots of well-known books. Confused? Let me explain. The magic of literature is at work here, and this magic is real. Now, The Hounds of the Baskervilles, Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz, and many other classic novels are not at all like you remember them. You'll help Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson restore the original plots of the books and deliver justice by solving tricky match 3 puzzles or unraveling hidden object scenes, and complete thrilling quests while searching for the reasons and patterns behind the events. I personally love these mysterious investigations with Sherlock, especially solving puzzles and investigating crimes. It's an exciting game that will help you relax and think as well. These tasks keep your mind sharp. And here's the cherry on top. You can get extra bonuses if you use my personal link in the description to download the game. Grab your extra bonuses from today to July 19th. You can get a PC version of the game or play it in your browser. Don't forget to create a G5 Friends profile. You'll need to confirm the registration and get even more useful gifts. It's completely free to play on PC, including browsers, Android, and iOS. So use my personal link or scan my QR code and join the legendary detective Sherlock Holmes in his unbelievable new investigations. Now, let's get back to our video. It was called Bombingham, and the title was not meant to be funny. Things were so bad in Birmingham, Alabama during the early 1960s that everyone, black or white, risked their lives just by walking through the city streets. A bomb could go off at any time. From 1950 to 1960, dozens of bombings were committed in Birmingham by unknown terrorists. Black homes or businesses were usually the targets of these explosions. In most cases, the victims were alleged to have committed an offense against the rigid structure of white supremacy. This type of transgression, which disturbed the fragile throne of white privilege, was considered so serious that a man could pay for it with his life. To live in certain areas of the South during this time, a person had to accept the fact that the animosities of past generations were still very much alive, and the frightening rule of white supremacy dominated the course of everyday life. This is the story of one of the most infamous crimes of 20th century America, the bombing of a church during a Sunday service, which left 4 innocent teenage girls dead. The men responsible hid behind the cloak of secrecy, intimidation, and the white robes of the oldest terrorist organization in the world, the Ku Klux Klan. For the last 40 years, this epic pursuit of justice, which spanned 8 presidents, inched forward to a bitter end, while the aging families of the victims looked on in patient anguish. But the terrible bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church on September 15, 1963, will never be forgotten. Its significance was nothing less than to alter the course of history and stir the conscience of a nation. The Civil War, whose passions and consequences extended far into subsequent generations, was firmly embedded into the psychology and culture of the Deep South. After the fighting was over, racial segregation became a way of life in parts of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and other southern states. There were some people who wanted things to remain as they were, especially those of the older generations who still remembered tales of the Old South from their fathers and grandfathers. Bitterness dies hard, and the hatreds left over from the Civil War festered like an open wound in many southern communities. During the war years, homes were burned, lives were ruined, and fortunes were lost. Families who lived and prospered on the same land for generations found themselves homeless and financially destitute. For this ravaged landscape and a future that seemed just as dismal, many people blamed the freed slaves. And no group helped perpetuate those obsessive hatreds like the Ku Klux Klan, sometimes called the Invisible Empire. 6 ex-Confederate soldiers who were bored with post-war life in Tennessee founded the Klan in 1866. In a city with the odd name of Pulaski, these soldiers, some of whom were college-educated, got together and rode through the Lawrence County hills covered with white bedsheets. They named their club the Ku Klux Klan, a variation of the Greek word for circle, kuklos. Originally, these night rides were a source of mischief and fun. But superstitious blacks, recently freed from slavery, believed the pranksters were ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers returning for revenge. When the riders saw the terror they caused, they began to harass and intimidate local blacks living in western Tennessee and northern Alabama. This harassment quickly turned into violence. An ex-Confederate Army general named Nathan Forrest brought his talent for organization to the group, and soon the ranks of the Klan grew. Fueled by young, unemployed whites, resentful of the war and eager to strike out at freed slaves, the Klan became more aggressive. They broke into the homes of blacks and confiscated weapons, raided church services, and stole livestock. Under the leadership of the charismatic General Forrest, the Klan marched openly through city streets, dressed in flowing white robes and hoods. At the same time, they became a covert organization whose membership was a closely guarded secret. Members spread the word that the Ku Klux Klan was fighting for the honor of the South. Everywhere, blacks became the target of fearsome night raids in which homes were torched and the occupants either killed or driven from their land. Within a few years, the Klan became a veritable army. They controlled vast tracts of territory, and in some counties, they were the only law in existence. In South Carolina, the situation grew so urgent that the governor asked President Andrew Johnson for troops to seize control of the state from the Ku Klux Klan. In Alabama, the invisible empire permeated every level of governmental authority. Since no one knew exactly who was involved and who wasn't, no one could be trusted. Members included politicians, judges, police, clerks, and shopkeepers. The Klan's reign of terror continued almost unabated, for even when they were caught in the act of murder, it was nearly impossible to get a conviction. That's because it was just as likely that jury members and witnesses were part of the Klan family. Targets of the Klan were usually blacks, but whites who showed sympathy towards blacks were attacked with special enthusiasm. Teachers in black schools were systematically murdered and their homes burned to the ground. Anyone who stood in the way of Klan justice was cut down or simply disappeared. Throughout the 1920s, the KKK entered its golden era and boasted publicly of a membership in the millions. In 1928, the Ku Klux Klan, in all their hooded regalia, paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue in the symbolic shadow of the nation's Capitol building. They were at the zenith of their power. Author Win Craig Wade, in his book on the history of the Klan, The Fiery Cross, writes, "The Klan helped elect 16 men to the U.S. Senate, 9 Republicans and 7 Democrats, 11 governors, 6 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and an unknown number of congressmen. Hiding behind the mask of legitimacy and pretending to fly the banner of patriotism, the KKK had seduced many innocent people into its ranks. Even President Harry S. Truman was once a member. He resigned after attending one meeting. So was Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black and President Warren Harding, who once issued free passes to Klan friends that allowed them to drive through red lights anywhere in America. It was difficult to find a village, town, or city in the South that didn't have a KKK in its midst. In Alabama, the problem was incalculable. Martin Luther King once called Birmingham the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of police brutality is known in every section of this country. Alabama had been a breeding ground for the Klan since the Lawrence County raids began during the 1860s. In 1948, the Federated Ku Klux Klan was formed under the leadership of Dr. E.P. Pruitt. In Wade's book on the Klan, he quotes Pruitt, "The Klan don't hate nobody. In fact, the Klan is a good nigger's best friend. My nigger maid washes my Klan robe for me." In city politics, the terrible specter of Klan power was always felt. If an elected official didn't conform to the racist philosophy of the secret society, he or his family was threatened in a variety of ways. Most often, it was a phone call in the middle of the night or an anonymous letter. If the official didn't go along with the wishes of the Klan, his home was bombed or burned. During the 1950s, the civil rights movement was gathering steam in America, which directly threatened the survival of the Klan and the mythological image of Southern life it claimed to represent. The Supreme Court had endorsed school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the beginning of the end of white supremacy had begun. The anger and frustration of those who clung to the segregationist view of the Old South quickly turned to violence. From the period of 1948 up to 1957, there were 48 unsolved racial bombings in Birmingham alone. An old industrial city of 350,000 people, Birmingham was the largest and most volatile city in Alabama. Its black population was severely segregated in every way, economically, socially, and especially in the labor market, where they were confined to menial, low-paying jobs. Under Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, an admitted supporter of segregation, the bombings had virtually no chance of being solved. Klansmen sometimes rode along with city police on patrol. Even the police officers who were not members were afraid to react, lest they become the next target of the fanatical Klan. Governor George Wallace. During only 1 month in 1957, 4 black churches were bombed in Birmingham, as well as at least 7 private residences. Most of these attacks took place in the Fountain Heights section, where black families were moving into a predominantly white neighborhood. These bombings were so commonplace that the neighborhood became known as Dynamite Hill. Even the city's newspapers used the term in print. Klan terrorism reached epidemic proportions. Violence seemed to be everywhere. On Labor Day in 1957, 4 Klansmen abducted and tortured a black handyman. They were arrested and received long prison terms. When George Wallace later became governor, he pardoned all 4 men without explanation. Such was justice in Alabama. The terror continued into the 1960s as the tide of civil rights reform pushed on. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Birmingham to organize a protest movement against city government. What he found there moved him to tears. Its unjust treatment of Negroes in the courts is a notorious reality, he wrote from the city's jail. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro houses and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in this nation. Dr. King was able to win concessions from local businesses to take down the whites-only signs and begin hiring blacks for more meaningful jobs. But Chief Connor Bull called King a liar and a self-promoter. That same night, bombs exploded at a local hotel and in the home of King's brother. A riot broke out in the black community as several thousand blacks took to the streets. President Kennedy sent federal troops to Alabama as a warning, and the violence was soon stopped. More bombings followed. In August, several bombs exploded on Dynamite Hill. No one was killed, but again, fighting quickly erupted. A black man was shot and killed by the Birmingham police, and dozens of others were injured or arrested. Cops were pelted with bricks and bottles. Stores were looted while young people, both black and white, roamed the streets, eager to vent their anger and frustration on the first victim that crossed their path. Most of us felt we were caught in a war zone, wrote Elizabeth H. Cobbs in her book Long Time Coming. We could feel the battle bearing down upon us. This wave of lawlessness persisted throughout the summer of 1963, and at the core of this chaos was the mysterious Klan, unseen, unknowable, seemingly limitless in power, and able to strike at any time, at any place. It was into this poisoned atmosphere of racial hatred, in a city of fear where no one was safe and everyone was suspect, that 4 little girls, who knew nothing of civil rights, attended a Sunday service at the 16th Street Bethel Baptist Church. By 9 a.m. on September 15, 1963, the class, which consisted of 80 teenage girls, began to assemble in the lobby of the 16th Street Bethel Baptist Church. Though it was still summer, the morning was cool and crisp, with the temperature just into the 60s. Autumn was only a week away, and it would be a welcome relief from the summer heat. LSC Demand led the class, and the focus of instruction was The Love That Forgives. The girls descended into the basement where several hundred adults, who were attending formal Sunday services, were in the area on the first floor directly above Mrs. Demand's class. Most of the girls knew each other and had grown up in the same neighborhood. They had attended the same schools and were all members of the same church. The spiritual leader of the church was Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, whose home had been bombed no less than 3 times. Once on Christmas Day, 1958, his home was completely demolished by an explosion. Police Chief Connor's reaction was to ask Reverend Shuttlesworth to take a lie detector test to clear his name in the bombing of his own house. These tactics attempted to place suspicion on leaders of the Black Civil Rights Movement. The goal was to portray them as rabble-rousers, agitators, or un-American. They were frequently described as communist sympathizers. As Reverend John Cross delivered his sermon to a packed church, the girls listened attentively to Mrs. Demand's instruction in the basement. There were a few latecomers, and the students turned to look as they entered the large room. Denise McNair, 12, who was in the Brownies and loved to play baseball, strolled in from the lounge area. She saw Addie Mae Collins, 14, sitting on the floor giggling with her classmates. In the group were Cynthia Wesley, 14, who played in the local school band, and Carol Robertson, 14, who aspired to be a singer. It was a friendly time, and most of the group undoubtedly was looking forward to the end of Sunday class so they could return to their homes and play for the rest of the beautiful day. Then, at 10:22 a.m., their world ended. A massive explosion shook the church to its foundation. The noise was deafening. The entire 16th Street wall of the building collapsed into the room amid screams of terror. Broken glass flew through the air like bullets. Rocks and chunks of mortar crashed into the ceiling and into opposite ends of the basement. Those that survived said the incredible force of the explosion propelled the little girls through the air like rag dolls. It sounded like the whole world was shaking, said Reverend Cross later in court, and the building, I thought, was going to collapse. All the stained glass windows in the upper part of the church were shattered. The basement room filled with fine dust and all the lights went out. But one window pane, which later became symbolic of the explosion, had remained mostly intact. Only the face of Jesus had been blown away. "We've been bombed," someone screamed. Almost immediately, people who had been attending services upstairs ran toward the sound of the explosion. Some did not know where it originated, only that it was somewhere in the church. Maxine McNair, Denise's mother, had been in the choir area with friends and upon hearing the explosion, began screaming. She and the others started down the steps toward street level. My baby, she cried. As the adults reached the basement steps, which had been demolished by the blast, some of the frightened children began crawling out through the wreckage. A few of the wounded had to be pulled from the rubble by other children. But others were missing. As the children lay bleeding in the streets, rescue units began arriving. Crowds of neighborhood youth descended on the 16th Street Church as the stunning news raced through the black community like an electric current. "They bombed our children," someone cried in agony. Within minutes, the first of the dead girls was pulled from the rubble of the basement. It was Denise McNair. In succession, the bodies of the other victims were removed. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson were dead, their Sunday dresses shredded into bloody rags, their bodies horribly mangled. They were all found almost within the same location, Reverend Cross said later, as if they'd been thrown on top of each other. A fifth girl, Sarah Collins, who was Addie Mae's older sister, was dug out from under large slabs of concrete and stone. "I don't know what happened," she later told police. "I was calling for Addie because I thought she and the others had run out of there." Sarah had 21 pieces of glass embedded in her face. Though badly injured, she survived. Hundreds converged on the church. People were running all over the street, one witness told the press, screaming, hollering, and throwing rocks at the police officers as they arrived. Meanwhile, dozens of survivors staggered out of the smoking ruins, their faces and bodies covered in blood and dust. The explosion shattered windows in buildings across the street and turned over several cars parked near the church. During the investigation, It was thought that the bomb consisted of at least 15 sticks of dynamite. The device was apparently placed outside the church under a flight of steps that led to the basement. More medical personnel soon arrived and began to care for the injured. But the huge crowd continued to grow, and many people were digging in the rubble searching for more survivors. Police struggled against the frantic rescue workers attempting to keep them out of the crime scene, but it was impossible. "The police are doing everything they can," Reverend Cross shouted through a bullhorn. "Please go home." Injured and still covered with his own blood, Reverend Cross broke down in tears, unable to continue. The 4 girls at the Baptist church weren't the only ones to die that Sunday in Birmingham. James Robinson, a black 16-year-old, became involved in a rock-throwing incident with a gang of white teenagers. As he fled from the scene, Robinson ran down an alley near the 16th Street Church and was promptly shot in the back and killed by a white City of Birmingham police officer. A few hours later, on the outskirts of the city, 13-year-old Virgil Ware, black, was riding on the handlebars of a bicycle with his older brother. From the opposite direction, a red moped, decorated with the Confederate flag, quickly approached the 2 boys. Without warning, the operator of the motorbike, a white 16-year-old, pulled out a gun and shot Virgil twice in the chest, killing him instantly. The moped sped off. The shooter, who was later convicted of second-degree manslaughter, received a 7-month jail sentence. In the meantime, back at the Baptist church, furious crowds milled about the 16th Street intersection, while shotgun-toting policemen arrived by the dozens. Fistfights broke out, and the situation grew more intense by the hour. Black men, still clad in their Sunday suits, covered with dust and sweat, dug through the rubble to search for survivors. On a corner just down the street from the smoldering ruins, a solitary white man stood motionless at a police barricade. He stared down toward the church, narrowing his eyes to see through the acrid smoke. Charles Van, a mayor's aide, was on his way to the scene when he spotted the man. He knew the man as Robert Chambliss. He later told reporters the man was looking down toward the 16th Street Church like a firebug watching his fire. Within days of the bombing, the national outcry became enormous. One Alabama newspaper said, "May God forbid the bombers who put a bloody amen to the hour of worship. The shame will be ours forever." The Birmingham News wrote, "Not one word or a million makes up for the deaths of 4 innocent children in the Sunday school bombing yesterday morning." The Birmingham World said, "Is Birmingham a sick city? The United States government and other law enforcement agents must leave no stone unturned until the perpetrators of this heinous crime are brought to justice." President John F. Kennedy expressed grief and outrage from the White House at the deplorable conditions in the state of Alabama. Even Governor George Wallace, the nation's most public supporter of segregation, was aghast. "It was a dastardly act by a demented fool," he said to reporters, "who has universal hate in his heart." The FBI sent dozens of agents to Birmingham. This was in addition to the staffing that was already present to investigate the previous series of bombings. The FBI followed up hundreds of leads that poured into local law enforcement offices. The Alabama State Police and the Birmingham City Police joined forces in an all-out effort to identify and apprehend the killers of the 4 girls. A reward fund grew to over $75,000 in just 3 days. Klan members were under scrutiny as never before, and many of them became paid informers for the FBI. On September 30th, 3 Birmingham men were arrested on charges of possessing dynamite. The suspects were identified as Charles Cagle, John Wesley Hall, and Robert Chambliss, the same man who was observed near the church on the night of the explosion. Although they were not charged with the 16th Street murders, investigators believe they were involved in the bombing. Chambliss, who was called Dynamite Bob, was well known in Birmingham as an outspoken racist and a suspect in previous bombings. He was also a known member of the Ku Klux Klan. But Chambliss maintained a favored relationship with the city police department. It seemed he had open access to the police and occasionally rode along with cops on night patrols. He kept a police band radio turned on most nights and helped police in his local area, often arriving before the police, wrote his niece Elizabeth H. Cobbs in Long Time Coming. He caught one man under the 26th Street overpass and pistol-whipped him before the police arrived. It was said that Chambliss enjoyed the quiet approval of Chief Bull Connor himself, and therefore was untouchable in the city of Birmingham. The outcome of the charges against the three men confirmed that belief. They were fined $1,000 and given 6-month jail sentences, which were suspended. In the meantime, the Klan, never squeamish when it came to spreading its twisted vision of America, refused to remain silent. "It's 4 less niggers tonight," shouted the leader of a hate rally in Florida. "Good for whoever planted the bomb. We're all better off." For months after the explosion, FBI agents seemed to be everywhere in Birmingham. They followed Klan members around the city incessantly. Informants were put on the payroll, and dozens of written statements were taken. The reward fund grew steadily until it reached nearly $80,000. Pressures to solve the case were tremendous, but the FBI slowly plodded on. Family members, girlfriends, and acquaintances of known KKK members provided the FBI with a great deal of information, which was faithfully recorded in thousands of pages of written reports. In the meantime, agents had recruited John Wesley Hall, who was arrested with Chambliss and Cagle. Hall had failed a polygraph test concerning the church bombing, and the test indicated that he knew more than he was telling. But it was not enough for an indictment. Another paid FBI informant had deeply infiltrated the Klan, and the Bureau relied on his information despite suspicions that their own informant may have been involved in the church bombing. He twice failed lie detector tests in which he denied participating in the group's bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, writes Kurt Gentry in J. Edgar Hoover, The Man and His Secrets. The months dragged on. Still, there were no arrests. However, the FBI's suspicions settled on a local Klan group called the Eastview 13 Clavern. Through hundreds of interviews, the FBI concluded that 4 individuals were responsible for the 16th Street Church bombing. These 4 men were Robert Chambliss, Bobby Frank Cherry, Herman Frank Cash, and Thomas Blanton Jr., all members of the Eastview 13 Clavern. It was later discovered that Chambliss himself had bought a case of dynamite from a store in Daisy City, Alabama on September 4, 1963. He also had made incriminating statements to family and friends before the bombing. Agents said Blanton's vehicle was seen near the church at 2:10 a.m. on September 15, 1963. Photograph of his car positively identified, the report reads. In the same report, the FBI said Blanton's alibi for September 14, 15, 1963 cannot be verified, and stated to Bureau agents that he had heard Chambliss say he would make a shrapnel bomb. In their reports on Chambliss, the FBI said he was a logical suspect because of his acts of physical violence against Negroes and his free use of dynamite and terrorizing tactics. He was known to be active in the Ku Klux Klan activities since at least 1946 and was exalted Cyclops of the Clavern until 1951. Although he denied involvement in the church bombing, Chambliss admits to FBI agents that he purchased a case of dynamite, but denied knowing the ultimate use or present location of this dynamite. However, Hoover did not approve of an arrest at this point. He felt the prosecutors could not get a conviction in any court in the South at that time. Hoover believed that the Black Civil Rights Movement was under the control of foreign and domestic communists. During the early 1960s, the FBI had several ongoing investigations of Black political organizations and leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was active in the city of Birmingham during 1963. Hoover had no ambition for involvement in civil rights issues. Instead, he became obsessed with the destruction of King, whom he saw as a communist and a troublemaker. This obsession continued even after King's assassination in 1968. Hoover amassed a file on King that consisted of thousands of pages. Although agents favored a prosecution of the 4 suspects as early as 1964, Hoover would not approve of a meeting with U.S. attorneys. According to a review of the case by the Department of Justice, which was obtained by the New York Times in 1980, Hoover stated, "The chances of a prosecution in state or federal court is very remote." In addition, Hoover was so tight-fisted about what the FBI knew about the bombing that all the details in the case were never completely passed on to the Department of Justice. In 1970, William J. Baxley, a 28-year-old lawyer, was elected Attorney General of Alabama. Baxley grew up in Alabama and was in college when the 4 girls were killed in the explosion in Birmingham. The event made a strong impact on the young student, and he told his classmates that if he ever was in a position to do something about it, he would. "It was a real traumatic thing to me," he told Patsy Sims, the author of The Klan, in 1992. "I was just hoping it would be solved and some of those who did it would be punished, electrocuted, or whatever." After graduating college in 1964, Baxley became an assistant district attorney in the city of Dothan in South Alabama. After working as a prosecutor for nearly 6 years, he left the job to become the state's attorney general. Baxley notified his staff that solving the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing would be the priority of his administration. For the next several years, Baxley's investigators worked tirelessly on the case. They re-interviewed witnesses, developed informants, and traveled thousands of miles tracking down dead-end leads. By 1973, it was obvious that very little progress had been made. Baxley became convinced that, to solve the crime, he needed to know what the FBI knew. Although Hoover had closed the case years before, the FBI maintained the voluminous files on the 16th Street bombing. They had spent years in the Birmingham area, talked to hundreds of people, and had a stable of Klan informants. And there was little doubt that the Klan was behind the murders of the 4 girls on September 15, 1963. But the FBI was not eager to share its files with local authorities. The official policy of the Bureau was not to share anything without the personal approval of J. Edgar Hoover himself, a fact which hindered many state investigations and angered local law enforcement for decades. Sims writes that the FBI later attributed its reluctance to assist him, Baxley, to a fear that the terrorists had direct pipelines to local and state law enforcement agencies. However, the net effect of the reluctance was a stalled investigation and more years wasted. Baxley kept the pressure on the Department of Justice with frequent visits to Washington, D.C., and personal appeals to federal officials. He appealed to the U.S. Attorney General for help and wrote to members of Congress explaining how the FBI was becoming an obstruction to justice. Even so, the FBI would not budge. It wasn't until 1976, when Baxley threatened to bring the parents of the 4 murdered girls to a press conference on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and tell newspapers how the FBI was withholding crucial information, that the Bureau finally gave in. In the spring of 1976, the files on the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing were turned over to Baxley and his team of detectives. Once again, the investigation picked up steam. Stories began to appear in the newspapers that a solution to the case was near. Rumors circulated around Birmingham that the power of the Klan would soon be broken. Over time, Baxley managed to enlist the support of Elizabeth Cobbs, the niece of Robert Chambliss. She provided the Attorney General's office with incriminating statements made by Robert Chambliss before and after the bombing. A family friend, Gail Tarrant, also claimed to have called the Birmingham police on the morning of the explosion and reported that a bomb was placed at the church. Tarrant told police that the day before the bombing, she heard Chambliss ranting about, quote, the meeting place where the niggers plan their marching. In September 1977, a grand jury was formed to hear testimony concerning the involvement of Dynamite Bob Chambliss in the church bombing. On September 24, 1977, an indictment was finally issued, charging him with the murder of Carol Denise McNair. Chambliss was located at his home in North Birmingham and immediately arrested. "This is all politics," he told police on the way to jail. "They're just using politics to get me arrested and in this mess so they can make some hay of it. Baxley's behind it." In November 1977, the trial of Robert Chambliss opened in the Jefferson County Courthouse in downtown Birmingham. Reverend John Cross testified how he was teaching a class at the church on September 15, 1963, when all of a sudden an explosion went off. It sounded like the whole world was shaking. Police and fire marshals followed him to the stand and testified about the condition of the crime scene. But the star witness in the case would turn out to be Chambliss's niece, Elizabeth Cobbs. She took the stand on November 15th. "I saw Robert staring at me, as though his stern anger would enable him to intimidate me into silence as it had for so many years," she wrote in Long Time Coming. Cobbs told the jury that Chambliss had said before the bombing, "Just wait until after Sunday morning and they'll beg us to let them segregate." After the bombing, Cobbs said she overheard Chambliss say, "It wasn't meant to hurt anybody. It didn't go off when it was supposed to." Other witnesses testified that Chambliss had possession of dynamite during the summer of 1963 and spoke about giving those explosives to fellow Klan members. One neighbor told the court that she accidentally discovered tied-up bundles of oversized firecrackers when she was in the Chambliss house. Another witness, who saw a white man near the 16th Street Baptist Church during the early morning hours of September 15, 1963, also identified Chambliss. It was enough for the jury. On November 19th, he was found guilty of murdering Carol Denise McNair and later sentenced to life in prison. Since Alabama law prevented Bill Baxley from serving more than 2 terms as Attorney General, he could not be re-elected. He made several attempts at the governor's job but was unsuccessful. Baxley blamed his obsession with the Birmingham church bombing. His successors did not share his enthusiasm for the case, and as a result, it was mostly abandoned. During the late 1980s, there were several attempts to jumpstart the investigation, but those attempts went nowhere. By 1997, however, the FBI and the Birmingham police announced they were reopening the case as a result of new information that might now allow them, 34 years after the crime, to bring the others to justice. For months, a task force had been following new leads and interviewing old witnesses, with the ultimate aim of presenting the findings to a grand jury. A New York Times editorial of July 11, 1997, praised the move. There's considerable evidence against them, the suspects, in state and federal files, and simple justice demands that every effort be expended to give these men the punishment they have evaded for 34 years. In Birmingham, U.S. Attorney General Doug Jones would be the man in charge of the prosecution team. But already, the FBI was not happy. Portrayed as obstructionist, the FBI took exception to the way it was characterized in the media. In a press release, the FBI said it had valid reasons for withholding certain information from local authorities. Foremost, the Bureau did not want to expose and thereby jeopardize their many Birmingham informants who were deeply embedded in the Ku Klux Klan. Secondly, there was a strong distrust between federal agents and KKK sympathizers in the Birmingham Police Department. Former Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley backed up the FBI in a newspaper article published years before. In it, he wrote, "They had every reason to distrust a Deep South law enforcement officer in a race-based case. But the investigation crawled forward agonizingly slow. Federal agents located and interviewed 59-year-old Bobby Frank Cherry, then living in a ramshackle trailer in East Texas. Thomas Blanton Jr. was still living in Birmingham and was questioned by Birmingham police. Both suspects maintained their innocence and said they had nothing to do with the killings. Agents already knew that the 4th suspect, Herman Frank Cash, had died in 1994 without implicating any fellow Klan members. Old witnesses were again called in for statements and depositions. In the spring of 2000, the case was presented to a Birmingham grand jury. On May 16, 2000, Cherry and Blanton were arrested on 8 counts of first-degree murder. The jury had indicted both men on all charges. This was a tragedy of just absolute proportions, U.S. Attorney Jones told reporters. It scarred the city of Birmingham for almost 37 years. There needs to be some sort of closure. "Judge, I swear to God I didn't bomb that church," Chambliss told the court at sentencing. "I never bombed nothing." Sheriff deputies took him away in handcuffs. 8 years later, on October 28, 1985, Chambliss died in prison. To the very end, he denied involvement in the bombing and never implicated any other Klan member. For the next 15 years, the case would lie stagnant. It looked as though the end of the road had finally come. The trial of Thomas Blanton opened in April 2001. Anticipation was high for conviction, but the evidence gathered against Blanton was circumstantial. There was no eyewitness and no single conclusive fact that pointed to Blanton as one of the bombers. In addition, the crime scene at the church produced very little hard evidence. An FBI report stated that, after careful examination of the debris at the scene, the laboratory failed to identify the type of explosive due to a lack of residue. No fragments of a mechanical timing device, fuse, or blasting caps were found. The prosecution could also not say positively how the dynamite was acquired, how it was brought to the 16th Street Church, or even who planted the bomb. Memories were less than accurate after 38 long years, and other witnesses had simply passed away. But back in 1964, the FBI had planted a bug in Blanton's apartment. Though Blanton, Chambliss, and Cherry were not charged with the church bombing, They were considered suspects almost immediately after the crime. The FBI succeeded in taping dozens of conversations with fellow Klan members that implicated Blanton in the bombing. On these tapes, he made several incriminating statements. "I like to go shooting. I like to go fishing. I like to go bombing," he once said to a friend. At one point, Blanton blurted out, "I'm going to stick to bombing churches." On another tape, he could be heard telling his wife, "We planned the bomb." When another Klansman talks about the rash of bombings in the city, Blanton blurted out, "They ain't going to catch me when I bomb my next church." Prosecutors contended that these statements were tantamount to a confession. Defense attorney Robbins dismissed Blanton's statements as just two rednecks driving around, drinking, running their mouths. But it was hard for a jury to disregard Blanton's statements about bombing churches. In order to establish Blanton's racist views, prosecutors put several character witnesses on the stand who testified to the defendant's pathological hatred of blacks. He said, "All I want is a chance to kill one of those black bastards," one witness told the court. In closing arguments, U.S. Attorney Robert Posey said Blanton killed because he was a man of hate. The defendant didn't care who he killed, as long as he killed someone and as long as that person was black, he said. These children must not have died in vain. Don't let the deafening blast of his bomb be what's left ringing in our ears. Defense attorney Robbins countered by reminding the jury that a courtroom is not a popularity contest. There's people around the world looking down on the city of Birmingham. Don't get caught up in it. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Blanton was stunned. When he returned to the court for sentencing, he was asked if he had anything to say. "No," he said quietly. "I guess the good Lord will settle on Judgment Day." Thomas Blanton was sentenced to life in prison times 4, one for each of the lives lost on September 15, 1963. He was immediately handcuffed and taken away. Outside the courthouse, reporters interviewed U.S. Attorney Doug Jones. "They say that justice delayed is justice denied. And folks," he said, "I don't believe that for a minute." The mother of Carol Robertson, Alpha Robertson, then 82, and one of the last 2 surviving parents of the girls killed in the explosion, watched the scene from a hallway nearby. She spoke to reporters from her wheelchair. "I'm very happy that justice came down today," she said softly. "I didn't know if it would come in my lifetime." Bobby Frank Cherry was 71 in 2002. He moved from Alabama to Texas back in the 70s when Attorney General Bill Baxley reopened the bombing investigation. When Chambliss was convicted in 1977, he figured he was next, but it never happened. Cherry moved from job to job. He worked as a truck driver, a clerk, a welder, and drove a cab. It was reported that he was married 5 times and fathered 15 children. Cherry was questioned many times by the FBI and other investigators in the case, but he never admitted to anything relating to the 16th Street Church. Once in 1965, when he was asked about his involvement, he reportedly said to cops, "That's when the Fifth Amendment will come in handy." After the Blanton conviction, momentum began to build. Though his attorneys had appealed to the court to excuse Cherry because of alleged brain deterioration, many people didn't believe it. "The delay the court has given Mr. Cherry," said Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth of the 16th Street Baptist Church, "makes it possible that he may confront his maker before he confronts a judge." Prosecutors later brought psychologists to the stand who testified Cherry was faking it. In January 2002, Judge James Garrett ruled that Cherry was competent, and the rusty wheels of justice began to turn again. "This is an easy man to prosecute," one attorney told the press, "because he's the human equivalent of a cockroach." The trial began in May 2002. U.S. Attorney Doug Jones would again lead the prosecution team. Jones put Cherry's former wife, Willa Dean Brogdon, on the stand. He said he lit the fuse, she told the court. Also damaging to Cherry was his own granddaughter, Teresa Stacy. He said he helped blow up a bunch of niggers back in Birmingham, she calmly told the court. Other witnesses testified of Cherry's recent statements in which he bragged about the bombing repeatedly. The secret tapes, which were recorded by the FBI back in 1964 and helped to convict Thomas Blanton Jr., were again allowed into evidence. These conversations showed that Cherry was not only a clan member, but associated with Blanton and Chambliss for years, which he initially denied to investigators. In his closing argument, U.S. Attorney Jones told the jury that Cherry was a murderer who lived among us. He said that Blanton, Chambliss, Cash, and the defendant were the forefathers of terrorism. After 6 hours of deliberations, the jury of 6 white women, 3 white men, and 3 black men found Cherry guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison. At his sentencing, Cherry told the court that he was framed. "The whole bunch lied all the way through this," he said. "I don't know why I'm going to jail for nothing." But his protestations fell mostly on deaf ears. In the back of the courtroom sat Sarah Collins Rudolph, 51, who lost her sister Adele in the 1963 explosion. "I feel at ease now," she later told the press. "We've been waiting on this day for a long time." Sitting in the back of the courtroom at the moment of the verdict, the veteran civil rights warrior and witness to the explosion that killed 4 of his flock, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, all of 80 years old, contemplated the gift of justice in the twilight of his life. "Justice will shine for black and white people now," he told reporters. Cherry died at age 74 in the Kilby Correctional Facility in Montgomery, Alabama, on November 18, 2004, after a long illness. From the day of the bombing in 1963 to the day of Bobby Frank Cherry's conviction on May 22, 2002, almost 39 years had passed. Many of the witnesses, participants, and investigators in the case had long since died. Even the civil rights era had faded into history. The Ku Klux Klan, although still in existence today, does not possess nearly the power and influence it wielded in the 1950s and early 60s. Birmingham, too, has changed for the better and bears little resemblance to its former self. It's undergone a total metamorphosis by separating itself from an ugly past and embracing a better and more hopeful future. The 16th Street Baptist Church still stands and has become an historic landmark of the civil rights era. A plaque that commemorates the bombing hangs inside its hallways for all visitors to see. It reads, Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson. Their lives were taken by unknown parties on September 15, 1963, when the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed. May men learn to replace bitterness and violence with love and understanding. On September 18, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the sermon at the funeral for the murdered girls. They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity, he said amid the tears of grief of that day so long ago. So they did not die in vain. God still has a way of wringing good out of evil. Good night, sweet princesses. May the flight of angels take thee to thy eternal rest.